Let us now speak of the Indiana Pacers, and third-time guest now, Caitlin Cooper is joining us. How you doing, Caitlin?
I'm doing well. Third time. That speaks well of me because anytime you get the return invite, then I'm confirmed that I wasn't a total disaster on the prior two episodes. So glad to still be here and doing a third episode.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate you coming on. I'm always like very touched that people are like happy to come on the show because I'm like, you're doing me the favor here. Like I'm depending on you guys. So yeah, let's get rolling here. And I kind of struggled as I was thinking about this show of just how much I wanted to talk about what took place a year ago. It's not strictly relevant to this podcast, other than the fact that two players who are key pieces of that team are not part of the team this year. But I guess I think people are just interested. So I'm going to ask you, of just as you look back on it now, 4 months hence or so, how are you feeling about that magical playoff run they had, which of course ended in such tragic fashion?
I mean, it's possible that the past might inform on the future to an extent because when you look at when their season turned around, it was during the break in the in-season tournament when they had 4 practice days in a row. It coincided with when Andrew was off the minutes restriction. He was defending at an all NBA level, and they also got Ben Shepherd back. Like their point of attack defenders were coming back, but part of the biggest reason why their defense made the upgrade that it did is because their offense got better. And when you really look
Hmm.
at, what is the reasons why their offense got better, it was mostly because Tyrese started looking like himself again. So, and because they stopped turning the ball over as much. The fact that they were able to limit turnovers to the degree that they did when they're passing the ball as much as they do, when they're playing as quick in transition as they do, as well in the half court and getting between actions. I think that that could be telling as to how they play this year because they're going to have to find other ways to compensate for the fact that I'm pretty confident they're going to turn the ball over more this season without Tyrese as the immaculate exception. And they're not going to have his gravity on the floor anymore. So it's going to change what they do. But after that point in December, they were a top 10 defense, they were a top 10 offense, and there was little inflection points that started making me believe like this team could, like, I had picked them. That I'm like, if there is a team that upsets Boston or Cleveland in the Eastern Conference, I'm pretty confident it's going to be the Indiana Pacers because some of the markers that I was noticing over the back half. So, really impressive season, incredibly fun team to watch. And I think it's going to be just as interesting this year to try to figure out how they kind of still, I think they're still going to want to play the same play style, but the little tweaks that they're going to have to make in order to make that possible is going to be an interesting puzzle for them to solve, I think.
Yeah, and especially with McConnell now out with this hamstring injury, we can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. You make an interesting point that when we've seen these beautiful game offenses before, the Warriors were the previous one, they always would struggle desperately with turnovers. Like on the plays when they wouldn't turn it over, they would have like a 135 offensive rating. But for the Pacers to be able to play that way and not turn it over and also play really fast, was pretty incredible. But they, of course, are not going to have Tyrese Haliburton probably this whole season. He hasn't been making the same type of noises that Jason Tatum has been making. I don't think he should be making those type of noises. But what do they get missing? I mean, obviously, we've talked about it for a long time. Just to remind people, just what are the unique things Tyrese Haliburton does that they are going to need to compensate for this year?
I mean, the Pacers were the top team in average touch time last year in terms of the fastest, and they weren't just the fastest last year, they were the fastest team in the last 6 years. And I know that Todd Whitehead, who works at Synergy, made a chart like showing some of the catch and hold times for just the individual Pacers after I did the podcast with Rick Carlisle. And then he showed Tyrese relevant to the rest of the league, and Tyrese was an extreme outlier in how quickly he makes decisions once he has the ball. So, kind of my favorite Tyrese stat that I think really speaks to how he kind of brings out the super in others is that they were bottom five and how often they were doubled last year, but they also attempted the fewest heavily contested threes of any team in the NBA. So they're generating really high quality 3-point shots without anybody on their roster really drawing extra bodies that frequently because he's constantly moving the ball faster than the defense can rotate. He's an important engine of that, but certainly their overall, random offense style and how quickly they get from action to action informs on it as well. But That they're going to miss. And then I know sometimes people like to box score watch with Tyrese at times and be like, he only attempted 6 shots. Like, he only had 9 points in this game. And I'll be like, yeah, but, the Nuggets blitzed him and the Pacers had higher than the highest pick and roll average in points per chance when he passed out of a blitz. So it's that type of stuff. And just the fact that he is a star who's willing to play off the ball and allow Andrew Nembhard to run pick and roll and play 4-on-4 with all that extra spacing that he creates. So you're missing the playmaking, you're missing the gravity. The fact that he is a player that gets picked up 94 feet creates a lot of space for the other people on the floor. So those are all certainly things. And then very quietly, while he was definitely the worst defender in the starting lineup, he is somebody that they really activated last year to be playing aerial ace and be getting deflections, turning other opponents over. So that's something that they might miss as well. And like I said, his offense certainly played a factor in why their defense improved, because when you turn the ball over less, when you're playing at this highest rate of speed, it's easier to get back. And also when you make more shots, it's easier to set their pressure defense, which has definitely informed their overall play style at that end of the floor as well.
Yeah, and this team was one that certainly upended a number of assumptions that I had. You mentioned Tyrese's defense, and I was very concerned about what that would look like on a deep playoff run, going up against some of these great offenses. And Ty Jerome had to actually change conferences to get away from Tyrese after after getting his floater blocked 97 times by him in that playoff series. But yeah, I mean, it's really, I could think of very few moments off the top of my head where another team like really profited by going at Tyrese over and over again, which was certainly not something you could say in past years. They also got better as a rim protecting team, which we can talk about. But uh, on the offensive end in particular, and I guess this will matter for defense too, as you said, both because of the feedback loops, but also because he's now going to have a larger offense role. Andrew Nembhard is going to step in as the starting point guard, and after his turn in the 24 playoffs, when Tyrese went down, I was like, well, why don't they just make him the backup point guard? Like, why are they still messing around with McConnell? Is McConnell really that good? And I ultimately I realized that was ridiculous, because McConnell and the depth and all that wearing teams down was so integral to their style. And they really needed Nembhard to, like, he and Tyrese actually were very additive, despite the fact that Nembhard is not this awesome spot up 3-point shooter necessarily. But Andrew Nembhard moving into the primary point guard role, what's that going to look like?
I mean, that's his natural position. That's the one that he's most used to doing. And when you look at his highest scoring games, many of his best games have come with him being the primary point guard. I'm sure you probably might have remembered the one that he played against the Warriors when
Well,
he
yeah,
went
we
off
were doing that game for NBA League Pass actually. So yeah, it's
and
seared into my retinas for
and
sure.
really attacking a number of different coverages throughout that game. He played point guard at the final 2 games of the Eastern Conference Finals against Boston, and he did some of that last year. The thing that I keep bringing up with Andrew is I think the most telling 2 games maybe is if you look at Game 5 against the Oklahoma City Thunder in the finals. By the time it got to the fourth quarter, because Tyrese had tweaked the calf in that game, he was very limited in the second half. Nembhard was virtually operating as the primary ball handler and point guard. By the time he got to the fourth quarter, I think he had like 3 turnovers in that quarter, and he just looked exhausted because he was also being asked to pressure Shai Gilgeous-Alexander the full length of the floor, guard the league MVP. Tyrese has always benefited from the fact that he has an Andrew Nembhard. He has somebody that, like, if I'm being pressured the full length, Andrew can run pick and roll. For all intents and purposes, he ran more pick and roll against the Cavs in the second round series than Tyrese did. He has a lot of guile as a pick and roll ball handler, and that benefits him, but he's not going to have a secondary ball handler next to him, really, in the starting lineup as much as Tyrese did. Certainly, Pascal will take on some of that. But, who's the Andrew Nembhard who's going to be guarding in the way that Andrew does 94 feet. And that's what the Pacers are going to have to figure out, because one way or another, like, I'll ask you, can you think of another player in the NBA who's going to be asked to do as much primary ball handling responsibility as Andrew Nembhard while also guarding the other team's perimeter player in the style that the Pacers do? Like, that would be unprecedented to me.
Yeah, no, I really can't think of it. Like, Jalen Suggs is not going to have, and if he actually even is healthy, he's not going to have that level of responsibility. Most of these ball hawking guards, if you look at the, like, Chris Dunn, like, he's not at that level. When you consider the pressure that they bring, and also not only just pressuring, because like anyone can pressure, but Andrew Nembhard actually does it well. Then when the guy gives the ball up, he's not going to let him get it back. He's going to be physical. He's going to piss people off. So yeah, I think it's really what they need from him offense. I mean, Rick even talked about this early in camp, I recall, Like it is going to be difficult. I think they're going to have to get that defense from some other plays. I don't think Nembhard's necessarily going to be Haliburton, although as you've noted, he's also like a really good nail defender too.
Yeah.
So like he can be effective in that role. But yeah, who if Nembhard's going to be the Haliburton, who's going to be the Nembhard? Maybe defensively is as much, maybe not as much, but certainly a key question in addition to just how Nembhard can step in offensively.
And I think the three major things that they'll probably look at, because like as I noted, Andrew as the primary ball handler against Cleveland really benefited from the fact that Okoro and Max Strus were guarding Tyrese at the logo. So he got to run that pick and roll 4-on-4. Like there's not going to be anybody with that degree of gravity when Nemhard's doing it this year. But I think you're going to see a lot more of Pascal as a secondary ball handler going back to his time in Toronto when he was doing that post Kawhi next to Kyle Lowry. So that will alleviate some from Andrew. And then defensively, it's going to have to be Mathurin. And Mathurin has some issues as a point of attack defender. He can pressure, he can turn the ball in the backcourt, but he's very prone to giving up rejection. Sometimes before the screen comes, he has a tendency to stand up out of his stance right when the screen comes. Sometimes after he stops the ball, he'll relax as if the job is done, and then he's very prone to giving up hesitation dribble. So with him in a contract year, I think more of that's going to get tilted that way. And, it might work out because part of the benefit of doing that is Andrew and Pascal are the two best off-ball defenders on the team. So even if Mathurin's kind of getting beat at the point of attack, hopefully I think that they're going to hope that they can benefit from having Aaron, Pascal, and Andrew behind him. Andrew's very heady with peel switches and knowing when to jump switch and those types of situations. So I think that that's what they're going to have to do, because I don't think it can be Andrew for an entire game, which to an extent kind of makes me as the person writing about this team a little bit sad, because Andrew has so many interesting quirks and nuances as a defensive player that I hope some of that doesn't get lost with how much more is going to be expected of him as an offensive player. And then the third way just being that they might just literally have to really be watching he and Pascal's minutes heavily, because of how much more is going to be asked of both of them this season. And certainly playing deeper into their roster is part of what made them what they were last year. And I think they're going to have to continue doing it, because I think this is going to be even more of a play hard team than what they were stylistically a year ago.
Yeah, you mentioned those little intricacies with Nembhard. I wanted to just like send Andrew or Ty Jerome's agent a copy of your note that Andrew Nembhard likes to pull the chair,
Yeah.
because in 5 games Ty Jerome never figured that out, and that's like Ty Jerome is so dependent on like getting his shoulder into the guy, knocking him back, and shooting that floater, and Nembhard would just back off, and Jerome would just fall over and throw it away. It was incredible. I mean especially like that's just such a genius move in this day and age. So for those who do you want to actually explain what I'm talking about when I say he's pulling the chair on drives?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the first time I saw him do that, they were in Boston, and it was a transition play with Jaylen Brown really operating at full speed. Nembhard got back, anticipated when Jaylen Brown was going to do the move that you talk about a lot, where players like to use the off arm and shove off a bit. Andrew anticipated that bump and just pulls back, similarly to what you'd be doing on a post up when you pull the chair when the player goes to make a power move. The difference being is, like, it's one thing to anticipate that when it's a static post up. It's a whole nother thing to anticipate it against a driver. And he's done it against so many different types of drivers. Like I've seen him do this against Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who has quite possibly the most unpredictable next step in the NBA. I've seen him do it against Trey's hostage dribble, like from behind, anticipating where Trey's going to get in front of him and jail him. And Trey's fallen down. I've seen him do it against Zach LaVine in crunch time. So like all these guys move very uniquely, and yet he still just has such a strong feel for he can apply like 800 pounds of pressure as a defender, like he's a weighted blanket, and then he can release that. So he's talked about it before, like whether pulling the chair or taking a charge. Like that was something that I really wanted to get to over the summer, was just to ask him, like, how is this something that you develop as a skill? How do you practice this? Because it really just takes, having, like I said, this tremendous processing from him in order to do this. And he did it throughout the playoffs. Like you mentioned, Ty Jerome, Donovan Mitchell, Jalen Brunson, all were victimized by this one way or another. And so many guys have signature moves on offense. He has a few, very intelligent signature moves on defense, with that being the most prevalent for sure.
Yeah, I mean, longtime listeners to this show, I'm glad that you pay attention to my work enough to know that I whine about the off arm all the time. But yeah, I mean, especially because like it's not really a fair move in the sense that you can just bludgeon guys out of the way and transfer all your momentum. But you're also kind of selling out to do that and really flying into the guy. So if there's nothing there, then you're going to fall over. And he's really taking advantage of that. Do you think Mathurin, does it make more sense for Mathurin or Neesmith to guard the guy bringing the ball up and vis-a-vis like the best opposing wing threat? Do you think one of those guys, the other fits better on one of those archetypes?
Yeah, I mean, in the first game of preseason, Mathurin was guarding Anthony Edwards, which is not what you would have seen. Tellingly, when the Pacers played in Minnesota on the road last year, they played an all-reserve lineup with the exception of Nembhard, and Nembhard was guarding Anthony Edwards. So that was kind of an early telling thing that, like, they're going to let Mathurin do more of this. I think the thing with Aaron is Aaron can be very foul prone in general, but especially so when he has to guard at the point of attack for an entire game. So that didn't necessarily show up as much in the playoffs against the Knicks when he was guarding Jalen Brunson as it has a tendency to do in the regular season. It seems like his physicality gets whistled a little bit different in the
Mhm.
postseason than the regular season. But also, I think some of the consideration with Aaron is that they need Aaron to do for Pascal what Ben might need to do for Andrew at times, and that Aaron will likely be taking on a lot of the top wing assignments so that they can benefit in the ways that they do with Siakam as a guardrail, really using his lateral size in the gaps. The playoffs were a little bit different view because it isn't often that you see like Pascal guarding Giannis, Pascal guarding Cat like he did in game 6. A lot of times they will put him onto lower usage wings so that he can be back behind the pick and roll, or like I said, really just stalking the gaps with his size and the way that he does. So I'm guessing that they're probably going to want to shift more of that onto Aaron versus at the point of attack. And certainly it's a big opportunity for Mathurin because the one thing that I do think is, headed into contract talks for him, assuming that he and the Pacers don't reach an extension when he goes into restricted free agency, when you're guarding at the point of attack and you're applying pressure, that's very visible, good, bad, or otherwise. So if he succeeds in this role, I'm sure other teams are going to recognize and be like, hey, maybe he's a little bit more viable defensively than what we thought.
Yeah, has there been any reporting that's come out? I haven't seen any on the state of the extension talks with Mathurin.
I have not seen any either. I'd be
Yeah,
surprised. I
okay.
mean, just personally, I would be surprised from both sides if they found a number that made sense. Either direction, because to me it doesn't really make sense for Ben when he's going into a starting year and could potentially be getting more shots, having a bigger defensive responsibility to accept a lower number. And from the Pacers perspective, it doesn't make sense to do this ahead of time when there's been ongoing issues with how he fits their style of play, with how he molds and complements Tyrese. Because one little quiet thing from the interview that I did with Rick is that he mentioned on that podcast that it was important to Mathurin to be a starter. And whether that's just for this year or in the long term, if it's important for him to be a starter, right now, as things stand, I think you would have a hard time coming up with a compelling case for why he should start over Andrew or Aaron when Tyrese is back. But certainly he has a year to try to dispel some of the concerns that you might have in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the train that they should try to trade him. Obviously, this was when Tyrese was healthy because they didn't really have the salary slot for him,
Yeah.
and he was going to continue not starting, and his value would only decline. I don't think they ever seriously explored that. I certainly have no indication of that, and so yeah, now it's totally different. Like he's gifted a starting role, the one that he's always wanted, because it was kind of shaping up to be sort of like a Kaminga East situation
Yep.
for him, and now he's going to get that role. I mean, they're desperate for any kind of creation. And yeah, I mean, if he can establish, I mean, and he really, there are three things that I think are really preventing him from being a starter level player. And even fixing one or two of them would probably get him there. One is just being like a really effective spot up shooter or a guy who can even like come off screens and make shots. One is just doing something more once he gets inside the paint other than head down to the basket and get fouled. And then the other one, as you mentioned, is becoming a quality defender. I think if he fixes even one of those things,
Yep.
he could maybe get paid at the level that he wants to, although this team does not necessarily have room for him in their salary structure, but they could move things around. If he proves that he's way more important than Obi Toppin, for instance, they might be able to do something there. We haven't talked about the loss of Miles Turner yet. How much are they going to miss him?
I've put it this way that I think that it's entirely possible and likely that they could take a step back at that spot without Miles Turner, but in the long run, they might end up taking a step forward. I had concerns after the Eastern Conference Finals with what his performance was against Boston a year ago, but I understood at the trade deadline, like, yes, he's entering a contract year, but this is literally the best basketball that the Pacers have played in the Tyrese Haliburton era. Like, you need to figure out how good this team can be. Obviously, they make it all the way back to the finals again, but I don't want to be harsh with what I'm about to say. I think in some regards that was in spite of Miles, not necessarily because of Miles. I thought he was quite good against Milwaukee and Cleveland, but that's in part because of what defensive schemes Milwaukee and Cleveland were deploying. I thought it was a struggle against New York, and I thought it was a really big struggle against Oklahoma City, which he was sick for part of that series. But I think that's an important question for them to ask, especially with Tyrese coming off of injury, as to Tyrese definitely enhanced Miles Turner in the pick and roll. I think they need to ask in the reverse how the center is going to enhance Tyrese. Because especially against the type of defense that Oklahoma City plays, you really have to attack early. They started running a lot more handoffs, a lot more get actions to attack their help coverages so that Tyrese could get down the hill quicker. And Miles just has very little craft as a screener and as a handoff operator. His overall recognition when he's being cross matched or against a switch wasn't good enough for where they needed it to be in that series. And when Miles was on the floor, Tyrese actually had fewer of his touches in the paint than when Miles was off the floor. So just having him as a static spacer wasn't exactly opening up the paint for Tyrese, especially against a defense that pretty much no matter what is going to prioritize loading up at the blocks and the elbows. And then against a team too that forces more turnovers, the Pacers had a higher turnover rate against Oklahoma City than they did in the prior 3 rounds. The rebounding became more important. I have a phrase: the basketball is the most important part of basketball. The team in the finals that had more offensive rebounds went 6-1 in the NBA finals. And that's not all because of Miles. Like, their struggles on the glass aren't totally because of him, but he's certainly a contributing factor. That's never been his strength in his career. So I think all those things are things that they need to consider with who they put at that spot moving forward. I will say I think Miles was more than good in the regular season for what they needed. They could certainly attack a lot of different types of pick and roll coverages between he and Siakam and Tyrese, and the fact that he can be put in the strong side corner allowed them to use inverted spacing with guards in the dunker and try some other funky things. So I think that that should be a consideration with who they find, especially in a Rick Carlisle offense. But to put it really simply, I was prepared for them to move on. I don't think that they wanted to move on in the way that they did. Like, I certainly don't think you want to lose him for nothing, where a sign and trade wasn't even an option. But I can also kind of understand from their perspective that they weren't really anticipating that the Bucks were going to waive Damian Lillard, because I can see criticism in the reverse that if they had quote unquote overpaid for Miles and maybe gone deep into the tax, that there would have been criticism of, like, well, who were they bidding against? Because barely any team had cap space. I don't think very many people were projecting the Milwaukee Bucks to be a cap space team. So um, I don't think that you want to get no assets in return. But I thought, I mean, Samson and I said this at our end of mailbag run, that this might have presented an opportunity. Both of those Achilles injuries, both to Dame and Tyrese, might have presented an opportunity for them to look somewhere else. Now, do I think that the answer is Jay Huff or Isaiah Jackson or James Wiseman in the long run? Probably not, although it would be a massive, massive win if one of those guys took a step forward. I think that they're still going to have to find somebody, but um, I didn't think that Miles was providing what they needed in the deeper rounds of the playoffs against those types of opponents.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think he's a really valuable regular season player. You know, you and I have kind of, I think you've maybe been a little bit lower on Miles than me, just because I guess maybe I see what else is out there at the center
Yeah.
position, and you know, having someone who can protect the rim credibly and shoot. You know, I think he's long been criticized, I think fairly, for not necessarily doing enough, but also a lot of his skills are somewhat latent and give space for other people. Now, I will say I don't think it's as much of a disaster for them now with the way that Pascal shot has come along since he's
Yep.
come to Indiana. You know, I thought it was a great fit for Pascal initially. I loved that trade for them because Turner could space and Pascal could work more inside, and that works great. But now Pascal is like, you know, a bona fide, like really good shooting threat from the four position, which I think probably hasn't been talked about enough of how his game has evolved since he's come to Indiana, particularly as he's gotten older. How much are you gonna miss Miles defensively, you think?
Here's what I'll say, and the internet got mad about this. I said he was the fourth best defender in the starting lineup, and I stand by that. I don't think you're going to come up with a compelling case for how he was better defensively than Andrew or Aaron or Pascal. And I think in part, why they kind of started the ball pressure trend in the sense that they did is because they needed to mask some flaws in the half court defensively that they were having. And that's why the pressure that Andrew applies is so important. But the one number that I think is the most telling here is that the Pacers pick and roll defense, when Miles was the screener defender without Pascal, was bottom five. When Miles was the screener defender with Pascal on the floor, it was top five. So Miles in and of himself wasn't necessarily propping up their pick and roll defense. Now, certainly a big part of that is the difference between Pascal as a secondary rim protector and Obi as a secondary rim protector. There's a pretty big chasm there. Pascal has one of the highest on-off defensive swings in the entire NBA. I think he was like 99th percentile in cleaning the glass. But I think that there has been some drop off for Miles as a rim protector in general over the last couple of years, and certainly when he needs to be a ball side anchor and pick and roll coverages. That's why quietly, like Pascal and his adaptation to the Pacers' overall system was one of the biggest reasons why they made the defensive turnaround that they did. He was just very critical as a linchpin, and also being somebody that's like, hey, we do actually in this series need you to go guard Giannis, or we do need you to finish off this series guarding Cat or taking on some reps against Jalen Williams. Pascal had some really rough moments playing in the Pacers defensive system after that trade verse happened, but he made tremendous strides. And I think that, he and Andrew, as far as their level of importance to what the Pacers did, were at a higher level than I think what most people think with regards to. I think people see Miles's block numbers and probably assume he was their most important defender. And I don't think that's been the case for probably the last 2 years.
Well, I think also when you just consider the replaceability of the skill set defensively, like I agree with you. I thought he had a better defensive year last year than 2 years ago.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
But there was also a lot more around him, as you noted. So yeah, how are they going to replace him?
I mean, Rick likes to use the phrase center by committee. Right now, Isaiah Jackson's been the starting center in the two preseason games. They've played all four guys in both games. Jay Huff's coming off the bench. I do wonder if in the long run, they've been fairly candid about the fact that Jay's had to adapt conditioning wise to playing the way that the Pacers need to, and that he's still adapting to that. In Jay Huff's defense, I think that Memphis plays more uniquely than perhaps any team in the NBA did last year. So going from that, where you're basically not playing any pick and roll at all, and the way that Memphis schemed their defense was they really like to use he and Jaren Jackson at times and almost like a one man zone and be dropping them all the way back to the rim, and be expecting the other four players on the floor to apply, maximum lane and driving pressure to prevent guys from just playing in rhythm downhill. That's very different from the Pacers, who played Miles pretty high up the court in pick and roll coverages. So you can kind of see that adjustment period. I think there's going to be one, but I kind of suspect in the long run that I won't be surprised if Jay doesn't ultimately end up being the starter, just because what you mentioned before about like Pascal getting to play with Miles. Pascal's shot has come a long way. Like in the preseason game, I literally was watching him walk in to pull up 3 pointers, shoot out of the pick and pop. Sometimes he makes threes off of motion, but a lot of the things that they want to do in terms of like his elbow isolations, his post touches, were somewhat dependent on either being able to put Miles in the strong side corner, or sometimes Miles being the entry passer to Pascal from the top of the key. I think that's more replicable with Jay Huff. And then, as I said, with the difference in depth for Jay as a screener defender, I think like having Pascal behind him in some of those coverages makes a little bit more sense to me than Jay having to adapt to playing higher with Obi Toppin as the secondary rim protector behind him. Plus, just because, Obi can also play 5 out at center. Sometimes they do that. I think that the pairings generally in my head make a little bit more sense when it's uh, Pascal and Jay Huff as the starters and Isaiah and Obi as the backup tandem. But I certainly understand why they're going the way that they currently are. They have more invested in Isaiah as far as him being a homegrown center that they drafted, and also because I just think he was in better conditioning when training camp started than what Jay Huff was.
Yeah, I mean, Jay has always been a Nate's guy, but again, because of that unicorn skill set of being able to shoot and protect the rim, and also Jay, I think, can do some interesting stuff. Putting the ball on the floor for one or two dribbles, getting to the basket. But and I think he's a smart player. But yeah, I mean, he's been a 10-15 minute a game guy his whole career. Asking him to be the starter,
Right.
particularly in this system, is a lot. But same with James Wiseman and Tony Bradley,
Yes.
Isaiah Jackson as well. I mean, you mentioned center by committee. Is there anything in particular you think that the rest of those guys give? You know, you're kind of plugging the dike here and there with the ability to, you know, we need a certain skill set at a certain time, and you know we're just going to try to play hard with all these guys and do it by committee. So, what are sort of the strengths and weaknesses of all these guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Isaiah, like if I were them, I'd want to maintain some flexibility based on opponent throughout the season. Um, because let's say you're playing like the Toronto Raptors, who might run a lot of 4-5 pick and roll with Brandon Ingram and Jakob Pertl, or with Scotty Barnes and Jakob Pertl. In the past, the Pacers really kind of had to chase over with Pascal, play Miles either at the level or in drop because they didn't want to switch Miles on to Scotty or on to a player like Brandon Ingram. Now, if it's Isaiah Jackson, I think that they'll be more comfortable switching those 4 or 5 pick and rolls, and that will put the Pacers in a better position. They've already been doing some of that in preseason, so Isaiah is more switchable. He's more rangy. If you want to, play some 2-2-1 press or even just some full court press, Isaiah can cover ground better than the other options. He has some vertical pops. Certainly, I'll be curious to see if they experiment a little bit with him and be like, hey, maybe in some of our 5-out alignments, we're going to put you at the slot, kind of like what Quinn Snyder did with Onyeka and Clint Capella in Atlanta, or maybe we'll try some of those skip concepts that Kenny Atkinson put in with Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, where you're skipping it to the corner and then running like a grenade DHO to try to attack what some of the spacing issues might be. I think that there could be some creativity there. As far as the other,
Quickly, for those who don't know, what is a grenade DHO?
oh yeah, I mean it's basically just like if you can imagine like Darius Garland and Jarrett Allen are running like an angled pick and roll, and if you deliberately put Evan Mobley in the opposite weak side corner, his guy's going to tag because they don't necessarily respect him as a shooter. So it'd be Darius Garland skipping it, and then maybe you have Donovan Mitchell just flying to that left side into that corner and just getting the DHO handoff right out of the post from Evan Mobley to shoot, or potentially get a 2-on-1 option there. Kenny Atkinson's put in a lot of those things. Sometimes the Jazz will do the same thing with Walker Kessler in the corner. There's been some
Yeah.
experimentation with how NBA teams are using non-shooters and kind of leveraging the space that's given up to their advantage. But with regard to the other guys, Tony Bradley's probably the best rebounder of the four there. He does a pretty good job of just like getting to his spots, setting hard screens, doing what is asked of him, which is why he ended up kind of leapfrogging Thomas Bryant in the playoff rotation in the last 2 rounds of the playoffs. And then James Wiseman has a lot of size for position. He can run the floor. His first 3 steps are incredibly quick, especially coming off this Achilles injury. That's still been there. I'll be honest and say the jury's still out for me overall with his feel within this system. His knowledge of where to be positioning wise at both ends of the floor can be a little bit touch and go. Sometimes he'll really surprise you, and then other times it's like, why did you just stand behind Alize Johnson for an entire possession? Types of things. So they'll have to make a choice there. I think that they're going to value having 3 centers on the roster. I don't think they're necessarily going to keep 4, especially because of what the point guard situation is without having Tyrese, and now being without TJ McConnell for a month. They're probably going to have to commit that other roster spot to somebody who's going to be doing more of the ball handling.
What do you think of Pascal Siakam moving into a larger offensive role? Really is now the number one threat on this team. You mentioned he's also really important to them defensively. Going to turn 32 this year. How do all those factors come together into coming up with a projection for him this season?
I mean, Pascal's done more with less, is the way that I would put it. Last year was kind of an outlier for him because he adapted to the Pacers system at both ends of the floor, but like his usage rate was the lowest it's been since Toronto had won a championship. His touches per 100, I think, were the lowest they've been since his sophomore season, and his drives per 100, I think, were as low as his rookie season. So he really didn't have to do as much of as a ball handler. It was a lot more post ups, a lot more play finishing, early work, elbow touches, those types of things. And they really watched his minutes as well so that he could compete at the highest possible level at both ends of the floor, along with the developments he made as a shooter. Now, heading into this season, I think you're going to see some of those Toronto things needing to come back to the surface. As I said, they've already been candid. You've already seen it in the first preseason game that he played, that you're going to see him bringing the ball up the floor more, being more of an initiator. I think you're going to see his driving game come back. And what's interesting about it is and he even kind of talked about this, like, a lot's being said about me being the number one option. Like, that's not necessarily how our team functions, but for him, like, it's more likely that he might see double teams this year than what he saw last year. So I'm almost kind of expecting an uptick in his assist rate, even more so than his overall scoring output, just because I'm expecting him to see more doubles. Like I said, they're going to have to put like Isaiah or Tony Bradley or James Wiseman in the dunker, where in the past, when he got an elbow touch, it was like, oh, we'll put Andrew Nembhard there. And then the only guy you have to contend with at the rim is a guard. And I've already seen guys doubling from the top against him, one pass away. If Andrew or Ben standing next to him, where teams wouldn't have been as bold to do that when Tyrese is the player, one pass away adjacent in the gap. So I think the ball is going to have to move that way. But this is stuff that he's used to. Like, this is a guy who had to play like a piece of paper sliding through a crack in a door in a starting lineup that had Dennis Schroeder and Scotty Barnes and Jakob Pertl on the floor at the same time. Like, he's kind of used to playing out of a broom closet. So I don't really worry about him too much. And I think that the Pacers do a pretty good job as far as like his overall longevity of trying to make sure it isn't him being expected to do this in the Nick Nurse minutes load. Like, they're going to
Yeah.
try to keep that under check, I'm sure.
Yeah, when I talked about Boston with Noah Dalzell, one of the reasons that I was lower on them was I just felt that in this sort of a season for Boston, how hard are they going to push Derek White and Jaylen Brown? Like, how much sense does it really make to do that? And those guys are kind of pretty similar points in their career to Pascal, and that's going to be a big question to me for this Pacers team and where they eventually end up. Is, are they, because like he's really the one guy, as much as they want to play the system, well, they're not going to run as much without Tyrese. They just don't have as much passing on the floor without him. When we put it all together, we can kind of talk about how much that's going to hurt their system. But ultimately, like, Pascal Siakam is going to be the one guy that opposing defenses are going to fear can beat his man on a night-to-night basis. And so how often do they want to push that button for how many minutes, how many isolations, etc., is going to be, I think, a key aspect of this season.
Yeah, and I think that's something you're going to have to watch as the season progresses, because right now you're not going to hear anybody for the Pacers talking about a gap year. They're going to say, like, we want to be as competitive as possible. Like, the standard is a phrase that they were using at media day, is what their expectation is. But like, let's say that they get off to a slower start than expected. Their schedule is tough. They've already incurred several injuries during preseason. If it goes a little bit rougher than what they thought, that's something you're going to have to weigh, right? Like, how much are you going to want to push Pascal, but when you don't already have Tyrese and you're going to hope that he can still be that guy when Tyrese comes back, might be a decision that they have to think pretty long and hard about in the second half of the season, depending upon how things start out for them.
So it looks like the starters, you've got the four guys we talked about: Nembhard, Mathurin, Nesmith, Siakam, and center X. TJ McConnell out with the hamstring. Let's just pretend that he's back and available now. How's the rest of the bench rotation shake out?
Ben Shepherd hasn't been available for anything to this point. I think he was back at practice here recently, but he hasn't played in preseason, and he wasn't at the beginning portion of training camp.
What's wrong with him?
I don't even fully know what the injury is, to be honest with you. I just know that he's
No.
been out. And what's interesting about Ben Shepherd is outside of why organizationally it's very important to be starting Mathurin for a number of reasons. If you look at past history, like when they played in Atlanta for a 2-game miniseries and Tyrese was out, and the second game of that miniseries, because Andrew was guarding Trae Young the full length of the floor, and he was also being guarded by Dyson Daniels without Tyrese, and Dyson Daniels was ducking under every action. And the second game, they were like, we're going to start Ben Shepherd because we need Ben Shepherd to guard Trae Young so that you're not having to do as much. I think that there is a world where if the dynamics were with Mathurin weren't what they were, that there's a potentiality where they might prefer starting Ben Shepherd to starting Ben Mathurin. But Shepherd hasn't played, and with Shepherd hasn't been playing, Johnny Furphy and Talon Peter, who kind of fit into that same mold as system players who really make this style work in the in-between and what they all do defensively, have kind of shined, and some of them can do things that Ben can't really do. So we'll see how the 2-guard spot ultimately shakes out next to TJ. My assumption is that ideally it would be TJ, Ben Shepherd, Jarus Walker as backup small forward, Obi Toppin as backup power forward, and then likely Jay Huff based on what they're doing here. But however the center position ultimately shakes out, I think that's the top 10. But I do think that Johnny Furphy and Talon Peter looks pretty decent as a two-way option. Could have potential to crack in there at some point in the season too.
Be still my heart, Caitlin. Talon Peter, he could be on the path to being a Nate's guy. It could
He
happen.
should be a
I
Nate's
said
guy. He does like I said, he does some of the Ben Shepherd things, but he also has more to his driving game than I would have expected. He's a physical defender, and he's just it's a very cliche thing to say, but he knows how to play. And he knows how to play in the way that the Pacers want to play. So that's to his benefit for sure.
well, that's exciting that he's fitting into their system a little bit because I thought he just had like a little bit of juice off the
Yep.
dribble, had some pop in summer league. I it was kind of a shitty second round this year, but of the all the players I saw at summer league in the last half of the second round, I probably liked him the most. What was he 54th pick?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and that Furphy actually had a pretty good summer league as well. I thought even though he had that got dunked on pretty badly, or did I can't remember
He
now.
was
Did
the
he have
person
an
doing
awesome
the
dunk?
dunking. He has a lot of
Okay.
awesome
Oh, that's
dunks.
right. Yeah, it was he dunked on a Senge. That's right. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misremembered that for a few fans. But yeah, I thought he showed a little bit getting off the dribble as like someone who again, if he gets a little bit of an advantage in the system as a cutter or a go and catch guy,
Yep.
getting to the
He can punch
basket
a
and
gap.
finishing.
Yep.
Yeah, he's got like he can run the floor really well. I mean, hopefully I'm a little skeptical about how well they're going to be able to run on that starting group once McConnell comes back. I think they will be as effective on the second group, and he could maybe be part of that.
The first group's ability to run is really going to heavily depend on Mathurin. I mean, Rick's talked about this too, that they really need him to sprint to the corners because, like, if you look, the Pacers led the NBA in hit ahead passes last year. They were even better with Tyrese, but when Tyrese was off the floor, they were still top five. Andrew's very capable of throwing those, especially in early work situations where you're creating those longer pockets with Obi or Pascal. Difference being now is Pascal's going to need to be the secondary ball handler, so he's not going to be leaking out as much for those early post ups. Obi might be playing some at the five. That means he's going to be closer to the rim in certain situations. So it might not be as many leak outs, but like talking about Ben Shepherd, like he was one of the players that led the league in the percentage of his minutes that he played fast at 14 feet per second or greater because he's so reliable in that he is going to sprint to the corners. Ben can do this. They just need him to do it very consistently, kind of like what you mentioned before. Like they need Mathurin to be willing to shoot the open catch and shoot shots that come to him rather than always being quiet as wired to catch and drive. It would certainly help if he was a better live dribble passer on the move when he draws more than one defender. And then just his willingness to run within the system will be important for their ability. Because right now, like their pace has actually looked pretty decent in the two preseason games, all things considered. And given that they haven't had Tyrese, they had 28 fast break points in the first game, which isn't the most telling thing because preseason generally runs faster for pretty
Yeah.
much any team because of what the defense is. But I mean, they've talked about it. They still intend to play fast, whether they're able to do that throughout the year because of some of the caveats that I explained there, where your ability to attack a broken floor is very important to how they want to play random with their initial pace and not just their pace after. But it's going to look different because of who the ball handlers are going to be.
How about Jarus Walker backup three?
Yeah, I mean, Jarris has a really good opportunity in front of him because this is extremely reductive, and I realize that when I say it, but because Tyrese isn't available to play, there is now a full rotation spot available to Jarris to definitively be among the top 10. I thought that he had a pretty good game against the Thunder at home for the Pacers. The Pacers didn't play Andrew and Pascal or Aaron in that game, so Jarris was out there a lot. Part of the reason why I thought that he had a very good game, though, is because the Thunder played a ton of zone against the Pacers. And one of the places that Jarris kind of quietly thrives is making passing reads out of the middle of a zone or as a short roller. There just aren't a lot of opportunities, especially, now that it's going to be Andrew and TJ at the point for Jarris to get to do some of the short roll things where his, passing reads show up as much as they do. His shot has exceeded my expectations in the first 2 years of his career. There's a clip I wrote a little piece that isn't paywalled if people want to read it about him going to Orlando and working out with Pascal over the summer and Pascal trying to reinforce to Jarris what you just said about, the go and catch, punching a gap, like that Jarris needs to stop wasting his dribble. And it's really important for Jarris to do that even more so than Johnny Furphy because Jarris tends to rely on his floater more because he plays on his toes. Like he doesn't anchor his feet super well to play with force. So how it drives begins and him creating an advantage off the pass rather than being relied on to create an advantage off the dribble or with his finishing at the rim is important to his ability to thrive at the wing. So that's something that they're wanting to see him work on. But he had he had a couple flashes in the game against OKC that it's like, yeah, you want to see more here. He and Johnny Furphy are almost complete foils of one another, especially as defenders. Jarus is much more of an event creator, has very quick reflexes, really deft hands, and Johnny Furphy has surprised with his ability to more so play and contain. He's almost 6'9", and he's capable of getting over a screen and cutting off a drive and using his length to his advantage. Whereas I think that's kind of what people assume Jarris would be. And Jarris, as I said, is much more somebody who you rely on is like, hey, you can stay vertical as a secondary rim protector and kind of teleport to the rim. You can be effective in the gaps. You can generate steals and blocks in that way. So if it turns out that Ben Shepherd continues to be out or that they like Johnny Furphy, I kind of like the idea of having that much size on the floor with the second unit, especially if you need to play some at the 5 with Obi Toppin. Like, the more you can have length out there insulating Obi Toppin at the 5, the better.
Can Furphy shoot it all?
The issue with Johnny Furphy is that sometimes I think that he doesn't always read his defender as best as you could. Like, there was times in summer league where it's like, okay, a guard is guarding you. Like, why the double clutch? Um, he doesn't have the best read of when he should shoot and when he shouldn't. I think is some of the issue. And then his footwork isn't always where you want it to be. But I thought he was better above the break, at least with his willingness to put the ball on the floor than what he was during the regular season last year. A lot's going to hinge on his ability to make shots, though, certainly.
All right. Anything else that you're kind of focused on going into the season that we haven't talked about yet?
I mean, I think that the thing schematically that people can be watching with this team the most that I've noticed is the biggest difference sans Tyrese is when we're talking about the turnovers. The Pacers have been a heavy turnover team in these first two games. I don't think it'll be this exaggerated when their top guys are actually playing, but I do think it will be worse than when Tyrese was available. They're going to have to compensate for that in other ways. So last year they ranked 26th in the possessions per game that they averaged with at least 3 players crashing. And the first game they played against Minnesota, which they averaged like 4.5 last year, they had 30 possessions doing that against Minnesota. They've been the second highest crash team in terms of number of players in the NBA during preseason. You're seeing them, they're taking on the tagging up scheme that you would have seen Memphis do last year. Cleveland does it, Toronto does it, Portland does it some where, when a shot goes up above the break, you're going to see 4 players for the Pacers running to the backs of their matchups trying to scrum in, and that's their ability to make that, you might create a 50-50 opportunity, generate an offensive rebound, but also it's to keep your transition defense 5-on-5. They've really kind of been taking that on in preseason heavily, and they've generated some second chance opportunities from that. I think it also fits really well with their desire to pressure the ball. The more that you're crashing on the offensive glass, you're already setting guys up to be picking up whether the shot goes in or not. And that might be something that really benefits Mathurin as well, because Mathurin has been one of their better crashers as a rebounder. And if he's going to be picking up at the point of attack more often, those two things should go hand in hand. So their offensive rebounding rate is up. Their turnover rate is also up right now. And I think that the rebounding is going to be definitely something to be keeping an eye on for them throughout the year, because that hasn't necessarily been a feature of the Rick Carlisle coach teams, but you can tell that like they're going to have to try to bridge some of the gap in talent with their overall physicality at both ends of the floor. And that's one of the ways that they're doing it.
Yeah, as we've talked, one of the big themes to me, the offensive rebounding is interesting, right? Because they got to figure out a way to get some of these easy chances that they're not going to have with Tyrese. But that plays into one of the themes that I was kind of leaning towards as we're discussing this now is just like, are they actually going to have depth again? Right? Like I was extremely concerned about that. Right? Like the centers, this is on paper one of the 5 worst center rotations in the NBA.
Yeah.
TJ is going to be out, it seems like, for quite some time to start the year. They just signed Campaign. We'll see how he's going to fit in. This is a system that takes some adjustment. He's not someone that I would describe as like an Indiana Pacers kind of player. But if they're going to start Nembhard, like, can they get something out of Furphy and Talon Peter and Walker and Ben Shepherd? And can 2 of these centers hit? Because it seems like you're actually maybe a little bit higher on their depth. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but if they actually can still manufacture 10 real guys, then some of the things that made Pacers basketball so difficult to play against, even without Tyrese and without Miles Turner, and maybe even without TJ, can still exist. So how are you feeling about just the overall quality of depth? You've been somewhat complimentary to some of these guys like Peter and Furphy. You think these guys are going to be like quality rotation pieces this year?
I think the TJ piece is going to matter quite a bit. Last year they actually won the minutes, like over 1,000 minutes when Tyrese and Miles were both off the floor, which speaks to their depth. And I thought that there were times last year where TJ um, very quietly wasn't quite the same caliber of defender at the point of attack that he had been in the past. Like certainly he can still get some of the backcourt steals when he's pressuring, but in the half court you would start noticing like, oh, they just took him off that assignment. Or in the playoffs, like they kept trying to let him do that in the bench minutes, and then by like game 2 or 3 they would have replaced him with Ben Shepherd or somebody else doing it. But his overall ability to play with pace, his ability to generate paint touches, to be one of the highest volume drivers per 100, I think is something that this team really needs. And if they were going to have injuries at any position during preseason, the most important position not to have that happen at was point guard, because the Pacers were already a team last year that played heavily with at least two of Andrew, TJ, or Tyrese on the floor. Now, headed into this year, it was already going to be really hard to be playing any minutes with Andrew and TJ both on the floor. And now Andrew headed into a year where he's already going to have like unprecedented amounts of ask and pressure on him. Now his backup point guard's going to be out for a month. Like that definitely matters, because like what you're talking about, like Cam Jones, who they drafted, I was probably a little bit lower on after summer league. I felt like, his shot was a little bit erratic. He's extremely left-hand dominant. Like I wasn't confident he was necessarily going to be in the rotation to start the year or even be necessarily their third string point guard, but he's been out with an injury. Quentin Jackson just suffered an injury in the last game as somebody that they could, potentially peg in there as a two-way option. Ray J. Dennis is a little bit undersized and gives up stuff for them defensively, although he can make some threes for them. And then you're just like taking a flyer on campaign, because what else are they going to do? So, given their strength of schedule at the beginning of the year, I think not having, TJ out there, especially with how well he does mold with the other guys on that bench, particularly Obi Toppin, I think will matter. But I don't think that they're going to deviate from wanting to play 10 or 11 guys, because it definitely informs and allows them to play the way that they want to play on both ends of the floor. And like I said, I think that their physicality is still a strength. And if they're going to be a team that's like, hey, we're going to be consistently tagging up, we're going to be consistently crashing, and we also want to be pressuring the ball, because doing these things is going to help us compensate for what we're losing without Tyrese, they have to play more guys. So I'd be surprised, like if they didn't have injuries, I don't think that necessarily Johnny Furphy and Talon Peter would be generating minutes. But if they do have injuries, I'm intrigued to see more and see where it goes. I mean, that's kind of what this season in a way should be about, despite the fact that they're not necessarily terming it as a gap year. They're not there yet. We'll see. But I do think that the TJ loss is bigger than what people might assume.
Yeah, and the way that he's managed to maintain as a small guard, going to be 34 this year, was incredible already, and there's certainly a risk that he was going to fall off. It seems like he can always just run, and he can always pop off the ground for that mid-range jumper. But like you said, we saw, so, when he gets into a matchup against a good guard, he's just meat now. Like Jalen Brunson,
Yep.
Shea, like those guys, he just could not be in that matchup anymore. So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we'll have to see whether, because they're extremely reliant on him, and also if he can play a lot of minutes, then that maybe Nembhard can play fewer minutes. That means that Nembhard can then guard the ball more as well, and help their defense some. I think these guys would be bad on the defensive glass, unless Tony Bradley plays. You agree with me on that?
I think that there's a chance they'll be slightly better than last season, just because of the personnel that are going to be out there more often. Like, I don't think that this is ever going to be an elite defensive rebounding team, but Mathurin and Jarus were two of their better rebounders at both ends of the floor, in terms of like not only just grabbing the rebound, but also boxing out. I and I don't mean this derogatory. I'm not trying to throw dirt on the player, but it would kind of be hard to be much worse than what Miles is at the center spot as a rebounder. So I don't think that there's going to necessarily be a
And,
significant
I
drop
mean,
off there.
Jay Huff and Isaiah Jackson might be it, though. Honestly,
Yeah. I mean, we'll see. The Pacers have already been dealing with that for a while. And one thing too is
yeah,
that like Tyrese, sometimes guys were kind of clearing the way so that Tyrese would be the person grabbing the rebound, just because it would be
sure.
quicker to automatically get into what they want to get into, especially with how much he was being face guarded. So um, I don't think it's going to be a strength. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, are you gonna force any turnovers? I think they're actually going to miss Tyrese in that regard
I
because
mean,
he was
yeah, I
a
mean, quietly, I think
get a
that they
lot of
will
steals.
because, like I said, last year they were a team 2 years ago that really didn't wanna do a lot of peel switching at all because they wanted to teach good habits. They thought sometimes that the peeling led to some complacency, so it was really like guard your yard. Last year, they allowed that and allowed once they had built the habits, allowed more communication, and that really fit with what Tyrese does because he is one of the best players in the NBA at blocking threes, but also, like, they were really experimental with how and where they allowed him to help too. Like, sometimes you would see him as the low man going up and tagging on the pop, and they felt okay with that because they knew he could stick his arms in passing lanes and get deflections. So, it might actually take a hit without him out there.
All right. Anything else that we need to hit on before we try to predict what these guys are going to be?
I mean, I'll be interested to see exactly how the shooting shakes out for the Pacers overall
Mm.
because you know I think that teams that have, like Atlanta with Dyson Daniels, I think the Pacers are going to see a lot of unders this year. So how Nembhard can manipulate the unders, TJ's obviously been doing this for his entire career, but they don't have Tyrese's pull-up shooting, and not only that, but when Tyrese was on the floor, they shot 38% from three. They attempted 38 three-point attempts per 100. Very, very low percentage of those were heavily contested. Without Tyrese, it was like 34% and only 30 three-point attempts per 100. So, you know, clearly, without Tyrese in the preseason opener against Minnesota, though, they made 23s in that game and they had 28 fast break points. So apparently it doesn't matter that he wasn't out there. But I think that they're going to have to find other ways around what they're losing with his overall shooting. And like it might sound kind of dumb because he obviously is one of the best playmakers and passers at the point guard position in the entire NBA. But I think that there's a real possibility that they're going to miss his shooting even more than his passing.
Yeah, I mean, just general advantage creation in the half court, right? I mean, sometimes they wouldn't necessarily have to create the advantage for Tyrese to be able to dime it up if there's just a switch. But other teams knew if we just play some drop coverage against this guy, like we're totally screwed. Like
Yeah.
we're not. And that's where so much of what they did came from. Where okay, now if the big is up, Tyrese gets off the ball, and now you're playing this great point five basketball behind the play. And so just how are they going to get the defense scrambling, and particularly the lack of shooting too? I mean, that's the other thing. Like Miles Turner was one
Yep.
of the probably top five positional shooters. Tyrese Haliburton is one of the top five positional shooters at his position. And now you're putting in guys, I mean, Huff, how much is he going to play? It's just hard for me to see him playing more than 20 minutes a game. And Isaiah Jackson, James Wiseman, like these guys aren't going to shoot it. Tony Bradley, will clank a three off the side of the backboard from the corner every once in a while. But so I think you make a great point that they're shooting and just overall efficient scoring. Like who are the efficient scorers now on this team? That's I think is going to be a question mark. So like the only shooter that I really really think is good on this team now is Neesmith. Like they lost two of their three best shooters essentially
And
for the season.
quietly, like Aaron's or 3-point conversion rate in this playoff run was much better than the prior playoff run. And I think part of the reason why was because Andrew was running so much point as a secondary ball handler. Very few teams in the playoffs were putting, the Darius Garlands, the Jalen Brunsons onto Andrew anymore. Aaron was getting those assignments. So his conversion rate on contested threes was actually where he saw the big jump year over year, and in part like contested, yes, but contested against much smaller defenders.
Hmm.
So that's kind of going to be another thing to watch with Aaron is like, will he still be the guy drawing like the worst defensive assignment where he oftentimes has a size advantage, or will teams be willing to chance that on Benedict Mathurin in ways that they weren't with Andrew because Andrew was running so much pick and roll and it required so much screen navigation out of those players. So between Mathern and Neesmith, I'm going to be really interested to watch and see which one of them draws the weakest defensive assignment on a nightly basis and how that impacts both of them as scorers.
Yeah, well, let's see how much Ben is really going to be in action
Yep.
and versus kind of just sort of being static and then doing something when they throw it to him off of something else. I think that might determine that. So I'll go first here in terms of predictions. I think these guys are being a little below average on both sides of the ball. That's kind of how I see it at this point. And if they still had Miles Turner, I would be thinking, all right, they can be in contention for the 6th seed. And I think it's gonna. change a lot how they're going to play, particularly because they also lost Tyrese. Like, again, if they still had Tyrese and they're like, all right, now we just have like a normal league average pick and roll center, that's fine. We can get by with that. But I think that combination, the floor is just going to be so cramped. And then you also don't have the guy who's really going to push the ball. And then the two guys who are kind of most responsible for pushing the ball, be Nembhard and Siakam. Those guys are going to have these massive loads on them. And so how much are they going to be able to play Indiana Pacers basketball? Are they going to, is Siakam going to play 32 minutes a game again? So I think it's going to be, I was always like, hey, just play your guys more, Rick. What are you doing? And like, obviously I was proven wrong by that in the playoffs, but then now they're again going to have another layer of the underbelly of this team that's going to be exposed. And so how much are they willing to just throw those guys out there and try to beat everybody with pace and pressure versus just maybe the skill level just gets to be too below water if you don't have Nembhard and Siakam playing a ton of minutes.
So what number are you at for the prediction of wins?
I think I'm going to go. Well, I guess there's one other thing we got to talk about before I
Okay.
too, which is I think like Rick Carlisle has been in this situation in Dallas before. He has been willing to be a rather invertebrate tanker when the need required. If you look at some of those end of seasons in Dallas before they got Luka, I think they don't want to have a gap year. They have a culture of this team. You just don't need to run Andrew Nembhard into the ground. You don't need to run TJ McConnell into the ground. You don't need to run Pascal Siakam into the ground in a year that just isn't going to matter. And this team, I hope that they will be a championship contender again next year. I hope that Tyrese will be the same guy that he was before the injury. But it just, and especially if you mentioned their schedule is hard, I think like they're just going to figure it out eventually because they made that brilliant trade to get their pick back as well. One of the most underrated moves in league history, probably. And I think there is some disaster potential for this team too. Like if Siakam goes down, like what are they going to do, right? If Nembhard goes down, what are they going to do?
Yep.
So I think, you kind of have a high end of like, 42, 43 wins. They run through the tape. They start beating teams at the end of the year when their schedule is easier and they're not tanking and everyone else is. Like, sure, you can get there. But I also see like a low end, of 30 wins for this team. And part of that could be a bad start. And then it's just like, hey, let's, maybe we even trade Ben Mathurin as well if we're not going to extend him. And they just like get another high pick, and because I think that would be better for the team, honestly. Like, let's take it easy because they're not going to win a championship this year. They might in future years. So ultimately, I think the rationality of the long season, I'm not going to say for sure is going to creep in, but I think there's a chance where they're just like, what is the point of this? Like we've already proven we can be a successful team. We got higher aspirations than facing the Bulls in the play-in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the other aspect of it too is it's strange to say this in a year when you're not going to have Tyrese, but I think that they're almost in a little bit of a win-win because if they did make it into the play-in tournament and then get into the playoffs, or if they did squeak in as a 6th seed in a very weird Eastern Conference, that's going to be because Andrew or Benedict Mathurin had
Yeah.
like a really tremendous season. And if they had a really tremendous season, then you're just like, great, now we're going to add Tyrese back to this. If they don't, then they're going to get a lottery pick and then they're going to add that person, or they're going to trade that pick for something and get that back when Tyrese is back in a year. So it's like strangely kind of win-win to me, unless, as what you just mentioned, like the 3 players that they really like to stay competitive, both now and in the long term, the 3 players that they need to not get hurt the most are Andrew, Pascal, and TJ. And TJ is already going to be out for a month at a time in the year when they really don't need that. Because like I said, the schedule does start out fairly difficult for them. So I struggled with it a little bit because when I saw the Vegas over underline, I think was at 38.5. My temptation, and it's solely just because mainly my belief in Andrew and Pascal and what I've seen Pascal do with less spacing before, and because of my overall faith and trust in that coaching staff, which has already started making adjustments to try to, as I said, with the tagging up and the offensive rebounding, tinker for what they don't have and their adaptability. My inclination is to take the over. It becomes a little bit harder to do that when I know how important it was for them to have multiple ball handlers on the floor at the same time. And now that 2 of the 3 from last year aren't going to be there in the early going. So depending upon, like I said, depending upon how this portion goes and how well they can weather it, I agree with you that that should inform what they do in the second half of the season, because it doesn't make sense to me either that if they're not keeping their heads above water and looking solidly like, hey, we could still have a competitive run here, not with the same ceiling that we had last year, but like this could still be valuable for us, that maybe at a certain point in time you're thinking like, how much mileage do we really want to put on Pascal Siakam? I do think that that's a valid consideration that they need to have. So ultimately, I think just because of the things that I said, I'm going to lean slightly over there. There's a lot of pressure on me here because the last 2 years, I think I've only been off by like one win on what I've selected. I think I picked 49 last year and they won 50. I think I'll go 40. I could see 41, but I can also see a world where it's much lower than that, to be honest. Like I think that the circumstances are not great for how they're going to be starting the regular season.
Yeah, my heart wants to go over with these guys because I've just been wrong on them. I've been too low on them. And I feel like, am I failing to correct for that? Well, it's not really the same team anymore. And if they just didn't have an absolute sinkhole at center right now, if they just had a guy at center who's just like a low end starting center who's pretty proven, give you some rim protection, some finishing around the basket, offensive rebounding, I think they're also actually going to be really terrible guarding in the post. That's another thing because they just got a lot of guys who are just don't have a lot of heft with this group. So I'm going to go with 36 wins for these guys, and because I think they're just going to, and maybe that's probably like I'm maybe not hedging enough because I do think there's sort of a binary, either they're trying or they're not
Yeah.
aspect, and maybe that's going to cost them 3 or 4 wins at the end of the season. So maybe if I really believe this, I should be going lower. But I also am loath to bet against Carlisle and some of these other guys that I've
Yeah.
underestimated too much. But yeah, so I'm gonna go 36. You are at 40, and where can we keep up with everything you're doing this season?
Right. So on X, I'm at C2_Cooper. On Blue Sky, it's my full name, Caitlin May Cooper. And then if you go to either of those places, it's a link to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/basketball she wrote, where that houses all the written work and the videos. And then Samson and I still plan on doing some monthly shows on particular games on YouTube, which is just my name, Caitlin Cooper, on my YouTube channel, if people want to subscribe there as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, we always really appreciate you coming on. This is a privilege to have you, one of the best people in the world covering their local team. So keep up with Caitlin's stuff. Definitely subscribe to what she's doing, and also subscribe to Dunc'd on Prime as well. We are running a sale using the code preseason25. You can get 35% off a yearly membership of Dunc'd on Prime. We'll catch y'all next time. Till then.